the inspiration started with the last book. So I did a book on Yashodhara that tells the story of her life. She was the wife of the Buddha. She has other names in the literature, but her most common name is Yashodhara. And so I wrote her story after doing a lot of research, and I enjoyed it so much that I just, I don't think I'm done. I think I want to keep just telling the stories and not. I find that there's something in academia, we're very well trained. It does a lot of good to the mind to be trained academically, but there's a distance, there's a kind of, you step back and you stare at your subject and you assess it from afar. And when I did that last book, the idea was to not be so far away, that I wanted to get much closer to my material. And I kept feeling like I was a dance critic, but I never danced. That was the feeling that I had as a scholar, is that I would sit there with my pen and watch other people dance. And I thought, oh, hell, I want to get on the stage. Yeah. So that was a little bit of I had all kinds of reasons why I did it the way I did, but that was a big part of it, is that I just wanted to come in close. I wanted to participate. I wanted to feel the stories and not stare at them. So I wanted to climb in.
Your story does take us back to that time, takes us back to the women and their lives and their surrounds. It's quite remarkable the way you recreate it. But what were your sources? How did you do your research to create that?
That's a good question. The research is something I've been doing for 20 odd years, because I've been involved in early Buddhist stories for 25 years, since I started my PhD. I've been reading the early stories of the Buddha's life, of the early Buddhist women. Like, I've just been reading Buddhist stories. I just wasn't telling them. I was studying them. So I've been involved in this research for a very long time. Most of the stories built on Pali sources. Wherever I could use other sources, I did, but most of the research is coming out of the Pali Vinaya and the Therigatha. So those were the two major resources for this book. And I kind of follow the two of them and use the two in relationship. So and by the way, I know we'll have time at the end for questions, but if there's stuff I'm saying that you guys want clarification, Buddhist texts are so complicated. There's so many of them. Half the time we don't know what book goes where. So if there's any question that you have, or you want me to explain something, I'm very informal in my classrooms. I don't mind at all. So if you want to ask a question, please go ahead.
Well, perhaps you could tell us a little more about the Therigatha, which were the poems that the women,
yes,
the first nuns wrote, which I think was one of your main sources.
Oh, that was my baby. So if you haven't heard of the Therigatha and if you haven't read it, please correct that immediately. I really, really recommend that you all buy a copy of some translation. There's a whole bunch of translations that are out there. The one that I use, just somewhere not far from here, is a translation by Charlie Hallisey, who's a professor at Harvard. And it's a very beautiful, very accessible translation. I really recommend it. The Therigatha is a beautiful collection, what we think may be the oldest collection of women's voices in the world. So we have very few early texts that we think are in women's voices. So just to give you a parallel, in the Hebrew Bible, I think there's like one set of verses that scholars are almost unanimous may have actually been women's verses, and that's in the book of Exodus with Miriam, where she sings a song, and we think it may actually be a woman's voice. But that's just a few lines. Other than that, like here and there, we get a few lines, but basically we don't have literature that we think women produced. Most of the ancient sources that we have at this point, we're pretty sure are produced by men for men. There's probably exceptions in there that we haven't caught yet, but there'll be little tidbits here and there. What we have with the Therigatha is a collection of 73 poems that most scholars at this point are willing to concede were probably produced by a collection of women. And so this is about 2,000 years old, and it's an entire book filled with women's voices. And each poem is pretty much written by a different woman. So there's a couple poems where it's the same woman telling two different poems, but basically you have about 70 women's voices, and they tell you their stories. And it's so beautiful. And so they tell you the stories of their loss or their experiences of suffering, or what it's like to be married, or it's women's realities, or being prostitutes or being courtesans or being homeless. And you feel like you're really hearing women's, like it sounds like women. Like that's the thing. And they tell you details of their lives that you thought, these are women's lives. And what's so beautiful about these poems is they're all different. They have all these different circumstances. And so you're getting to know a whole collection of women that probably existed about 2,000 years ago. And they're all different. And at the end of every poem, they tell you, I studied the tradition, or I listened to the Buddha's words, or some kind of, I did the path, and now I'm free. And it's so unapologetic, so beautifully uncompromising. They don't say, the monks told me they think I'm making progress. Like there's not, like, you don't get anything like that. You don't get, the Buddha says I'm on my way. Or like, the men don't need to confirm them. They write their poems. They tell you about their lives. And at the end of each poem, they say, and now I'm free. And so these are stories of women's accomplishments, which we don't get in the literature either very often, like world literature. So we really do think that this collection of poetry may be the oldest collection of women's voices on earth that we have recorded. Women spoke before 2,000 years ago, but this is one that was preserved, and it's preserved by a male institution, right? Which is really also quite remarkable, is that this literature has been preserved and protected and passed on and held by the Buddhist community for 2,000 years. So I think just on that merit alone, it's worth it to look at it and to hold it and to think, these are our women ancestors. This is their voices.
And so the men passed on these poems orally, because
we think so. I mean, we don't know, right? We don't know how we ended up with this. We also have the Tathagata, which is poems of the first monks. So this was a literature that was out there, but there's a woman's book. So that's really quite remarkable. And it was preserved by the tradition. And the tradition is a male institution. I mean, there's no way around that. And yet they kept the Tathagata. And so for 2,000 years, it's been passed down, and we have it, and it's written, and the tradition still holds it. And it's considered to be part of the early Pali Canon. So it's a very, very special book. And it's been getting a lot more attention in the last decade. And so there's a bunch of translations that are available, and you can look at different ones and get to know it and listen to the sounds of it. But that collection, we think, represents some of the earliest Buddhist nuns that Buddhism produced, right? And so this is where you get the poem of Patachara, and this is where you get the poem of Mahapajapati, and where you get the poem of Vimala and Kisa Gotami, like all these characters, these women characters that we hear their stories, their voices are in the Tathagata. So that book became my very precious resource. And I thought, it's these women that I want to talk to in my book. These are the women whose stories I want to engage with and get to know.
And they are so very diverse women. You mentioned Vimala, who is a prostitute, and right up to, you've got members of the royal family of
that's right,
walking together.
So this is the thing that's interesting, is I've gotten so used to my book now and I've been living in it and in my imagination for such a long time that I forget sometimes the Tathagata is a collection of poems that we think as these first Buddhist nuns. And so there's a really good chance that a lot of these women did walk together to ask for ordination, but we don't know who those women were. So what you get from the Vinaya, so the other really important story, and I'm just wondering suddenly how many of you, I can't really see your faces, but I'm just wondering how many of you know the story of the first ordination. It'd be great if I saw your faces, and I feel like I'm doing the whole teacher thing. I'm back to like my COVID teaching, but if you guys show your faces and you can put your hands up, I can get a sense if I should tell the story, which might be more helpful. Would it be helpful for me to tell the story of the first ordination of women? I think that's probably helpful. Look at you guys, I'm getting to see your faces now, so much better. Hi. So I did this to my students a million times during COVID. So what we get in the Vinaya, so for those of you who don't, and again, just put your hand up and I'll tell you if there's something you didn't understand. The Vinaya is a collection of texts. It's about 7 volumes long in the Pali edition that gives us our monastic rules. right? And so the rules of how the monks and nuns have to follow. It's an amazing collection. It's really a lot of fun. It's a little bit wacky at times, right? Where the tradition tells you a story, everything's stories, right? So the tradition will tell you a story of something that a monk or a nun did. And then the Buddha will say, oh, you shouldn't do that. And so as a result of the story, he establishes a rule, right? And so it's very long because you get all these stories embedded with the rules, right? So that you have the rules and the stories, the backstories that go with them. And some of them are completely nonsensical and wild. And you're like, that didn't happen. Did the early monks really do stuff like that? And we don't know. But so it goes back and forth between rules and stories. And at one point in the middle of the Vinaya, you get the story of the women who we get the stories being told, and presumably by male monastics who are telling us how the women got ordained. And what they tell us is Mahapajapati Gautami, who's the queen and who's the woman who raised the Buddha, she, at one point in her life, decides to walk out of the palace. And she thinks, I'm going to go. Her husband is dead. Her son has become the Buddha. There's no one really left in the palace. And so she's fulfilled all of her responsibilities. There's no point in her sitting on the throne anymore. And so she decides, she's a widow at this point, I'm just going to choose a life of renunciation. And I'm going to go ask the Buddha if I can do what he did, if I can do the same thing. So this sounds pretty fine and not such a big deal, except that she is asking for something pretty radical if you pay attention to it. And what's radical is that the Buddha was teaching lay people. Men and women were in fact practicing the tradition. So she could have practiced the tradition sitting in her palace and being fine. That's not what she wants. She wants more. She wants to shave her head. She wants renunciation. She wants monasticism. So she's not just asking, can you teach me a few teachings while I wash the dishes? She's, I want the whole thing. That's what she's going to ask for. So she's already making a very bold move. And she steps out of the palace. And the text tells us that 500 Shakyan women showed up to walk with her. Who are these women? We have no idea. It's just this kind of staple, 500 women. So it's a narrative device that the Vinaya uses all the time, is they just give you these chunks of human beings. And so 200 over here, 5,000 over there. They just throw these numbers at you and you don't know, is it real or they just, who knows what they're doing. But we get 500 women walk behind her and she leads this giant pack of women to go ask the Buddha for ordination. Right? How did they find out that she was going to do this? We don't know. Was there like a big gossip vine? Was this prepared for weeks or did it just, we don't know, right? It just tells us 500 women walk behind her. And so this massive group of women walk behind her. So she's now the leader. So she's like the female Buddha almost, right? She's like this woman leading the women. And they walk to Bamboo Grove, which is a grove just outside Kapilavastu where the Buddha was residing because he had come to visit the city where he was from, to ask him, can women join the order? She's not asking, can you teach me meditation? She's not saying, could you teach me the noble truths? She's not asking for basic teaching. She wants to join the Sangha. That's the radical move she's making. So she goes and she makes her request on behalf of this conglomerate of 500 women that we don't know who they are. So that's where the Therigatha became my companion, as I thought, oh, those 500 women come from the Therigatha. So I used the characters from the Therigatha to fill that community because I don't know who those 500 women are. So they go and then she asks, could we join the order? And he does something very strange that no one understands and everybody's had theories about for the last 2,000 years. He says something very evasive. There's different versions of it depending on the Vinaya that you read, but it all kind of ends up being evasive, is that he says something to the effect of, best if you don't ask the question. He doesn't say yes. He doesn't say no. He just says, don't ask me this question. She asks a second time. He says the same thing a second time. She asks a third time. And so the third time is usually the charm, right? The third time is when, it's either a yes or no. And if it's a no on the third time. She's asked the third time. And the third time he says, according to the Vinaya, it's best if you don't ask the question. And so he leaves her kind of stranded, right? Because she's left home. And so this is also what's radical, is that she has left home with 500 women under her care, which I can assume as a woman who's been a queen all her life, that she has some sense of responsibility and knows how to lead, but now she's carrying these 500 women and she has nowhere to go with them, which is paradoxical because she's chosen a life of religious homelessness where you've given up safety of the world, but it's not how renunciation works, is that you give it up to then be embraced by a different kind of home. It's not a complete home. Very few people can live this kind of radical homeless life where you just stand there all by yourself in the wind. So you choose a life of homelessness to enter a different kind of home. It's not, renunciation still includes a home, even though it doesn't sound that, right? That's the paradox of monasticism. And so you need to go somewhere so that you can be safe, so that you can practice, so you have the conditions to serve you. And so she's left her home, hoping that he will receive her and give her a new home. And he doesn't. And he knows he hasn't given her that. So she knows and he knows. Most of us as readers don't understand what has just happened, but they know she can't join. And so now and she can't go back home. You can't shave your head and then in the first 5 minutes go, oh, this was tricky. I think I'll go back. You're not allowed to do that. Right? I mean, you can give up the robes, but not in the first 5 minutes, right? And traditionally you're not supposed to give back, right? So she can't give back the robes. She can't give up her renunciation just because it got tough. So now she's really stuck. And she has all these women that she's holding that are standing behind her. And so she's nowhere. And that's what the Buddha's answer has done, is put her nowhere. So it's a really, really difficult story. And it's a story that women have been wrestling with, that monasticism generally has been wrestling with since we started telling the story, is what does it mean? Why did he do that? What did he imply? Does he not want women around? Or he wants them, but nobody else wants them? Why couldn't he have embraced them? If he can't do it, who can in this time and place? It's a really difficult moment in Buddhist history. And then he leaves. He just goes off to his next town and the women are just kind of stranded there with nowhere to go. So that's the story that I've been carrying around for the last 20 years that I've gotten to know very well through Sakyadhita, all the years of going to Sakyadhita conferences and engaging with women who are monastics and seeing all the different ways in which they are wrestling with some of the very real limitations of monastic life for women, and listening to their stories and their experiences and how they read this story, how they interpret this story. And there's so much variety. There's not one way to understand this story. So he goes. And then she does something radical again. And I think we have not appreciated her radicalness enough. And I think even after finishing writing this book and starting to give talks, I'm even more aware of how radical she was. And I think I would have made her even more powerful in the book. But it's like something that I'm growing into understanding, is she goes for a fourth quest, right? So he says, don't ask this question. He leaves. And she just follows him to the next town with these 500 women behind her. And she basically asks a fourth time. That's 4. But it's supposed to stop at 3, but she didn't. And I'll bet you, the more I get to know her in my head, the more I think that if he'd said no in Vesali, she would have just followed him to the next town and asked the 5th time. I don't think she was done, because she knew that this needed to happen, right? This is my imagination that I'm reading into her. But the story tells us that she goes again. So he goes to Vesali and she shows up with all the women in Vesali, stands there, waits for him to notice her, which is really a kind of amazing thing. So she arrives with all these women, according to the Vinaya, and she just stands there. And she waits for the men to notice them. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't yell. She doesn't wave her arms. She just stands there and waits until they notice that the women have come. And they notice. So then Ananda shows up. This is all in the Vinaya. And he says, basically, what are you doing here? And he notices that she's got tears on her face. This is in the text. That her robes are covered in dust. And that she has a shaved head. And the question is, when did she shave her head? Because when she arrived the first time in Bamboo Grove, nobody described her. The text doesn't tell us she has a shaved head. It doesn't tell us she didn't. It doesn't say anything about her appearance. But now all of a sudden she has a very striking appearance. And the text tells us she has a shaved head. And so that anomaly has bugged a bunch of us who've been studying these texts and just go, was her head shaved before? Or was it not? We don't know. But all of a sudden the text tells us her head is shaved, which could be read as, and this is all a question of interpretation because we can't know what these texts were intending. I'm just giving what the text says and then what I've done with it. But it seems to me that she shaved her head in between. So after he says sort of no 3 times, she must have shaved her head. But he didn't give her permission to do that. But he didn't tell her she wasn't allowed to either. He left her in the gray zone. And I think that gave her an opportunity to say, fine, I'm in the gray zone. I'm shaving my head. But that's a very tricky thing to say, because then you have one of the most important women characters of the tradition almost defying the Buddha, which is a tricky thing to suggest, right? But we have a shaved-headed woman now. And so the tradition says, Ananda says, well, let me go talk to the Buddha. And then you get this very important scene in Buddhist history where Ananda goes to see the Buddha and he says, the women are here. And the Buddha says, yes. And he says, can they be ordained? And the Buddha says, it's the same answer as before. And he says, but how could you say that when the woman who raised you, the woman who took care of you all her life is waiting? And so there's almost a guilt question there. And then he asks the Buddha, can women achieve awakening? Well, actually, he asked that question first. First, he says, can women achieve awakening? And the Buddha says, yes. And then he says, how can you leave her there? And so the Buddha finally says, okay, I will give the women ordination, but it will be on condition. And then you get what has been for many people the most controversial part of this story is what is called the Garudhammas. And the Garudhammas are 8 rules that ostensibly put women in a situation where they are always inferior to the monks in terms of their hierarchy. So the first rule is that if a man has been ordained a day, and a woman has been ordained 100 years, she must bow to him. And this has been quite devastating. And so for most of Buddhist history, every monastic community has had to figure out what to do with these rules. So some communities have eliminated them. Some communities pretend they're not there, but then they show up only in formal occasions. Other communities are very strict about them. Everybody does something different with these rules. But the thing is, at the end of the day, every monastic community, male and female, has to figure out what they will do with these rules. You have to make a decision as a community, how you hold these rules. And so this has been the story that I've been thinking about for the last 20 years. This is the story that is at the heart of Sakyadhita, or part of it, right? Is this question of monastic equality or not equality, and how do we live with these stories in the 21st century? What do we do with a story, and what do we do with a Buddha who doesn't seem to want women around? How do you live with that? What do we do with that story? Because that flies in the face of what we want to think of him, right? So that's the story that I wrote. And to people, this group of women walking with Mahapajapati, I used the women of the Therigatha to fill that community. And so those are the sources that I used.
And after that, how many of the women were able to go on and practice and perhaps gain enlightenment?
Well, we don't know, right? So the Vinaya tells us there's 500 women. The Therigatha gives us 70-ish women. Whether any of these numbers are real or not, I mean, unlikely, right? But presumably some stayed, and I'm assuming some left. I can't imagine every woman who heard those Garudhammas was like, great, I'm up for this, right? I think women have always been thinking creatures and have always had discernment and have always seen the glass ceiling. And I don't think all of them have always accepted it. So I am assuming some women stayed and some women left, just like today, some women stay and some women leave. I think it's the same. So I think not that much difference has happened in the last 2,000 years. And that's what's a little bit shocking, is that I feel like we're still having the same conversation that I feel like I'm looking at when I read the Vinaya. right? One of the most amazing things that happens in the Vinaya is that Mahapajapati, she gets delivered these 8 rules that basically it's one after another telling her you will be at the back of the bus, right? So monks can instruct nuns, nuns cannot instruct monks. Monks can receive confession from nuns, but nuns cannot receive confession from monks. Like it's one rule after another of like, you will always be inferior. She says, okay, right away, which to me seems a bit weird because I think she would have conferred with nuns. But anyway, she accepts. And then the second she's ordained, she tells Ananda, do me a favor, go ask the Buddha if we could change the first rule. She wants an amendment. It is the first thing she does as an ordained woman is asks for an amendment to the first Garudhamma. That move to me is evidence she sees the glass ceiling. She doesn't like it. She accepts her reality. She tries to fight it. I mean, this is a full intelligent woman who's dealing in samsara like everyone else. And I can't imagine we are the first generation of women to see the boundaries. And I think she saw them. And I think she was strategic. This is all my interpretation. But looking at that line, I see a woman who says, okay, I'll accept it because that's what I have to do. And then the second she's in the door, okay, we need to work on this. Which seems to me as old as time and as familiar as ever.
Vanessa, you skipped over quite a bit of the story you tell. And
yes, so I didn't tell you this stuff. I was giving you the Vinaya and I was giving you the Therigatha.
Yeah.
So then I have to make a book out of that. So then there's characters. So then I chose women from the Therigatha that I would follow to help me tell the story. So the 3 women that I focus on, I didn't focus on Mahapajapati and Yashodhara. Yashodhara already got her book, so she's had her time. She's in this book, but she's there as like a side character. Mahapajapati, I could not do. It felt like trespassing. It was like telling the story from the Buddhist perspective. I thought, I can't do that. She's too much of a queen in my imagination. So I was not prepared to use her as my primary narrator. So I had to choose characters that I could live with and that I could work through. And so my main character is someone who's actually not very well known, and that's Vimala. She's a very, very minor character in the Therigatha. She gets 1 poem. She's not in the Apadana. She doesn't get much commentary. And she's kind of fabulous and a pain in the ass, I think. Given what I saw in her, in her poem, I was like, oh yeah, I like this one. So she was the one that I chose to be my main character. And so it's through her lived experiences that she's reckoning with these questions and following the women. So I used her.
She was a prostitute.
She's a prostitute. And she's terrible. She talks in her poem of like how she stands at the door with like her parts showing, beckoning men, like, come to my boudoir. Like, I just think she's like such a audacious, difficult character. So I thought, yeah, I can work with that. And she becomes free. And I think, yeah, that's right. So I can go with her. So she became my person. And then, Patachara, I knew I was going to spend time with her because she's been a big part of my imagination for as long as I've known about Buddhism. And so she has a very, very sad story. I'm sure most of you have heard her story. Patachara is a woman who runs off with a servant and runs away from her fabulous family that has lots of money and has this like eloping. She's one of the only women in the Therigatha who chooses her husband. And so she chooses, not amazingly, but she chooses, makes these decisions. So a very strong character when you think of that. And they elope and they run away and they have children. And when she has her second child, she decides she wants to go home because she misses her parents. And so she goes back home and she's pregnant and she has a little child and there's a storm. And so the husband says, okay, let's just wait the storm out, wait at the foot of the tree. I'll go get some wood and I'll make a shelter for you. And so she's sitting at the foot of the tree. Her husband leaves and the storm is getting worse and worse and he doesn't come back. And so she's alone, pregnant with her baby in her arms, and she goes into labor, which is such a devastating, I mean, this story just kills me. And so she goes into labor alone at night with her other child, gives birth under the tree. huddling under the storm, doesn't know where her husband is. The next morning, she gets up, no food, no water, newborn, bleeding, and like walks to find him and finds him dead. He'd been bitten by a snake. So then she tries to cross the river to go back to Savatthi, which is where she's from. You guys all know what happens next. Do you guys know this part of the story? I don't know how quick I should. Okay, I should definitely tell it to you properly then. Okay. So she's with her newborn child and her like 5-year-old or whatever he was. And the river that she was supposed to walk through has now swelled. Right. And so now it's a rushing river because of the storm, which incidentally, for whoever was in Korea, which I think is just, did she leave? Helen, you were there?
Yeah.
Sharon. Right. So when we were there, this happened.
And Sonja.
Oh, good. Okay. So you guys saw it.
Yasmin.
Oh my God. Okay. So you guys were all there. So, do you remember when we were at the monastery? Did you guys all come to the monastery? Right. So we're at the monastery and we walked over that like footbridge to go in. And then there was the monsoon the next day. Yeah. And all of a sudden that footbridge disappeared. Right. And there's this rushing river over it and you don't see. And I thought, oh, it's like Patachara. I had this like wild moment. I was like, this really, I'm such an urbanite because I was like, rivers can't swell like that overnight. Yes, they can. So the river swells just like it did in Korea. And all of a sudden you can't walk over it in just the space of one night, which I didn't think was possible. So now I believe Patachari's story more. And so she can't cross. So she has one child and a newborn. So she tells her 5-year-old or whatever he is, like he's old enough to stand on his own. She says, you wait here and I'll cross with the newborn. And so she wades into the river with the newborn at her breast and makes it to the other side. And she deposits her newborn on a big stone, like a rock area, right? And newborn is not going to move. So she leaves it there. She's like, okay, I did it. She turns around and she starts to wade back through the river. When she's halfway through, she sees a giant eagle swooping over her head. And the eagle lowers itself down and grabs the newborn in its beak. Oh. Or in its claws or whatever it did. And she starts to scream and she's waving her arms like this and she's screaming. Her son thinks he's calling. She's calling him because so the son thinks it's time to go. So he wades into the water and the water just swoops the child away. And so in the span of a few hours, she loses her husband and then her 2 children. So then there's nothing for her to do. So she just wades back out. She's lost both her children. She's probably still bleeding. And she walks back to her hometown. And as she's arriving in Savatthi, she sees like smoke. And this man is coming out of the village and she says, what's with the smoke? And he said, oh, the big storm last night, it caused a fire in her home and killed her parents. And so she lost her 2 children and her parents and her husband all in one day. And then she goes mad with grief. And so then she tears her clothes and she has no one left in the world. And for a long time, when I first engaged with this story, there's like a lot of stories like this in Buddhism that are so extreme that you think that can't happen, right? Or I don't know how to engage with a story like that. I don't know what to do with that. I live, knock on wood, in a safe little world here in Montreal, and I can't understand what that means. And then years ago, I came across a story of a woman who was in Thailand during the tsunami. And she lost her 2 children, her 2 sons, and her husband and her parents all in one with the tsunami. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, this can happen. But it's like there's certain things, it's like the river swelling, like there's certain things that somehow my imagination gets stuck on. And then some moment in time makes me think, no, these stories these are real stories. Right now, we're seeing wars all over the world where this has probably happened to a whole bunch of other families where the entire family is just gone. Right? We know this is happening everywhere right now. And so there's this, the stories become more important to me the older I get, because the more I realize, oh, this suffering is real. It's not just little bits of suffering. There are big bits of suffering. And so I wanted to be with her. I couldn't have her my primary character because I know I don't know that kind of suffering, but I wanted to get close to her. So she was another character that I brought into the story, but I didn't bring her too close because I have to respect what I can know and what I know I don't know. And I think if you write about an experience that you don't know, you'll not respect it. So these are some of the characters that I had to bring in.
And the other thing that struck me was it just wasn't a couple of days' walk. It was hundreds of kilometers, I think. And
yeah, so I measured it. I can't remember. I think it was like 400 kilometers, which I thought, oh, I could do that in X amount of time. Like I was like, I can do this in like a week. And then I thought, except that they don't have sneakers and they have elderly and they have villages where people will stop and ask them questions. And so I turned it into about 3 weeks.
yeah,
I thought was probably a fair amount of time for them. So they walk to Vesely.
and how important is it that they go as a group to?
I think that's everything. I think it changes everything. I mean, so we don't know what this group was, right? The Vinaya says 500 Sakyan ladies. I don't know what to do with that. The Tathagata gives us 73 poems of 70 odd very different women. And if this collection of this poetry represents at all that first group of women, then you are talking about women who are queens and princesses and prostitutes and courtesans and homeless widows and everything in between, all standing together. And presumably, I imagine, eating in the forest from the same plates and cooking together and taking care of each other and speaking different languages and coming from different countries that probably were at war with each other. I mean, everybody was at war all the time, just like today. They were all at war all the time. And so everything you read from ancient Buddhist literature is, you know, the Lichavis were at war with the Kosalans, which were at war with, like, I mean, everybody's at war all the time. And so these women are coming from these communities that were presumably at war with each other. So it's like Russian and Ukrainian women walking together and Palestinian and Israeli women walking together. Like this is a whole other experience that has nothing to do with the geopolitics of that day. And I find that right now, as I think of everybody being so divided, I find that just kind of this precious little thing of these women who just walked together and they said, we want something together. And they did it together. And then they became free together. That's what I think the Tathagata is saying.
And going back, these women were considered as property. So they had, or as you write, they had brothel owners and husbands and mothers chasing them, not wanting them to go on the walk. It was really very difficult for them to begin.
So this is what I imagine, right? Is when I try to imagine what life was like for a woman in ancient India, using my historical sources, I do think a lot of women would have had a very difficult time getting like and managing this. Right? This is a disturbance of the social hierarchy. It's still a disturbance if you become a monastic today, right? Like we disturb in all kinds of ways. Our lifestyles, our choices, we're constantly disturbing, but we have a lot more eclectic potential today. But I do imagine that if a group of women decide, I'm leaving you and I'm walking through the forest, I'm out of here, that's a disturbance. And so I imagine that probably disturbed a lot of people. So I'm imagining this, right? You have to understand that, like this, I created a world in my head that then I wrote based on a lot of research, but I don't know if I'm right. But I imagine this to me now, I've imagined it so long, I'm sure this is how it happened. But that's the trick of creative writing, is that you start to believe your own craft. But I can't imagine it any other way. How can women walk out the door, leave their husbands, leave their brothels, and it not really threaten a lot of stakeholders? it had to have threatened the stakeholders.
Yeah.
So I include that in the story because to me that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is it how it happened? I don't know. But now I kind of believe that's how it happened.
That really comes across. Vanessa, what are the lessons for Buddhist women today who not necessarily ordain, or perhaps Venerable Choki can talk to that, but women who want to change their lives, who want to do more with their lives? Are there lessons from this story?
Well, I'm sure everybody would take different lessons. I'm sure each of you have like thoughts about that. I think there's value to seeing these women as courageous. I think it gives us kind of women teacher ancestors I think I've had a lot of conversations over the years about these women where some Buddhist practitioners will get very defensive. Oh, the Buddha, of course he wanted women, or, the women would never have defied the Buddha, or like some kind of defensiveness about this story that it can't be problematic. And I think I understand why people are doing that, but I think we have an advantage to seeing the problems in it, because I think the problems in life are always there. And if we can look at ancient stories and go, wow, they wrestled with this too, I think that gives us courage to wrestle with our own reality and not put blinders on and go, every monk I meet is like the embodiment of, I feel like that's a real dangerous road to go down. So I think it serves to see the problems of the early Sangha, because then we're not alone in our current reality, that these problems have always been there and it's always been tough and it's never been ideal, right? The Sangha happens in samsara. It doesn't happen in nirvana, right? The Sanghas are samsaric. And I think if we can say that, we have a lot more opportunity to be honest with our reality. And I think we could move a lot more forward than if we protect everything and go, no, everything's fine. There's a lot of problems in Buddhism, in Buddhist communities. And I think we have to have the courage to go, oh, here it is again. These problems are probably 2,000 years old. I think we do ourselves a service by doing that. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we pretend everything has always been perfect and everything is perfect today. I think that's a really dangerous road to travel. So I think it helps to see that the women were struggling with something. I'm sure the men were struggling with it too. Like, what do the men do when the women show up? Like, you mad? Like, so that was also part of my story, is what do the monks do when all these women show up and they're like, hey, we're moving in? Like, I imagine the monks going, hold on a second. We set ourselves up. What are you doing? You're disturbing everything. We came here to get away from you. And now you walked in, right? Like it's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. It's messy. Buddhism is messy. Human history is messy. Everything's messy. And I don't think we serve ourselves well when we pretend that Buddhism is idyllic. So that's what I see in this.
It's time for questions, so let us know if you have something to contribute. But first, I'd like to throw to Venerable Choki. And just, Venerable Choki, how does this story resonate to you, being a monastic in a monastic community?
Well, I've been nodding all the way through, so it totally does. I was thinking a few things. A few things. At the very beginning when you were talking about the seating arrangements, that of course we have strategies to do that. But I was recently in Indonesia with His Holiness Taisitu Rinpoche, and I was warned. It was my first time being in a teaching live with him. And one of his nuns just warned me that sometimes he will put the nuns in front, in the seating. So he didn't at this occasion, but sometimes he'll put the nuns in front, and the monks just all do not like it. And I just thought it's great that he would, on invitation, place them in front, because there was one nun who sat inappropriately with the monks. And it was like, that only happened for one session. After that, she was like down the back of the hall. So very interesting to see. So I think what you're saying is these issues are still alive, but it was such a radical time there. They didn't have you know, the 20th century feminist framework. Well, they did. They had their own feminist framework. You know, it's been there forever too. And so just within, like I'm part of FPMT, and so our monastic community, IMI, and it is about also what's the future for monasticism? What does that look like today? And the fact that it looks like, is there a future? So I know in our tradition that question's being asked. So it was one point. This is not a question, this is some comments, but also that, you know, I was thinking about one text, Shantideva's Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where, you know, when the lamas have all been now educated, when you get to this point, the women are going to be challenging you, you know, and so there are a couple of points there. One of them is in terms of monasticism, you know, may there be the provisions for monks to go on retreat, and may women, the nuns, stop quarrelling with each other. That's the two things. That's the contrast. Mm-hmm. And what you're demonstrating is a great solidarity of these women coming together across caste, across, you know, socioeconomic divides, political divides, language divides, cultural divides, where they should be warring with each other, but they're not. And so I think that's a very, very powerful story. And thank you. I haven't got a question so much. I mean, I was interested in whether you used in your research feminist methodologies, but I think the answer is yes. It goes perhaps without saying. But so much of this is so relevant for us from a monastic. I mean, there are many, many stories, as you know, you know, for monasticism today. And when you see, like, of course, Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo debating with the Dalai Lama and stuff. So, you know, of course, we all, you know, pay our respects to His Holiness, and nobody dares peep. But Jetsunma really shows that way. We have to interrogate. We have to have these debates. And a few years ago, she came around our centres in Australia and debated with all the geshis and won the debate. And then she'd say, okay, that geshi's an open geshi. He's okay. And then, you know, so we need, you know, it's an invitation, or not an invitation, it's really imperative. I found that in my years of ordination. Now I feel like I'm getting more outspoken, and perhaps it's the time we live in, but it, you know, things need to be addressed and changed. Yeah. So thank you.
Vanessa, any comment on that? Vanessa?
Sorry?
I just said any comment on what Venerable Turkey said.
No, I appreciate it a lot. And I know it's really hard to be outspoken. So it's...
Well, it's easy for me because I'm a teacher, so I get to say it a lot, say things a lot.
I actually had a question for you. You said something about the question of, is there a future for monasticism?
Yes.
I'm wondering if you would say something about that, because that kind of...
we're looking at, and this, appreciate that this is within our organisation, but the Dalai Lama has said he's very concerned about the future of monasticism. And it's really about, I think, the future of the Dharma, that we observe that there's less people wanting to study, wanting to, I mean, I sort of think, wow, would we get together 500 women? We wouldn't even get five, you know, that there's less people ordaining, less people staying ordained. And that you know, we see like someone like Oso, where we're talking about at the beginning, leaving the monastery because that sense of being more effective as a lay person in this time. And so there's all those sorts of discussions going on. You know, is this the relevant way to be engaging? You know, we've seen with Catholicism, the nuns, who are still nuns, but they're in the community and they don't wear the equivalent of the robes, the habits, and they don't even wear the little cross anymore. So you don't even know. So they're within the community, and it seems to be that, in a way, where we do stand out in community, people appreciate that, because even they don't know you're Buddhist, they know you represent something spiritual. So there is a place, but how much, that it's a question more, I think, about what's relevant to reach, have maximum reach in the world today. Is it more secular? It is more secular. People have a sense of spirituality, but not necessarily, they're very wary of religion, So.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Jody. There's a lot to think about there. Look, it's definitely time for questions. So if you have a question, let us know. But I'll select a few. Sky, you've been involved in Buddhism and retreats for a very long time. What's your feeling about, this story of Buddhist women?
I can't really talk very much at the moment.
Oh, sorry.
I'm very breathless. But I'll have to read this book because I adore the Therigatha, and I just get so much inspiration from that. But I'm always looking at that connection between the nuns and lay life, and have gone through a journey myself as to whether I would take the step to become monastic or not, and decided my life is better living in the world. So it's always this wondering what if, or that I've dealt with over many years and come to a place of feeling contented with where I am at now. But it's been a journey. It's always inspirational to read other women's journeys from the history and how we can still relate to it so much. So thank you, Vanessa, very, very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Judith, would you like to contribute? You'll have to unmute if you would. I don't know what's happening. We can't hear you. Sorry, it's a technical problem there. Sorry, Judith. Sharon.
Thanks very much, Vanessa, for that wonderful insight into the early women of Buddhism. I was just had a little question, and as you were talking about it, do you think that the stepmother of the Buddha, because she was kind of like a queen, do you think that that's why she, took all those bold steps? Do you think someone, to become monastic, and if she wasn't, would she have done that? Do you think, if she was like an ordinary kind of woman in the street, would she have done that? Do you think it was her position of power that enabled her to be so radical?
I think that I didn't think of it at the beginning. So one of the things I learned about the story as I wrote it was I realized this is a crazy risk that these women were taking, right? Like, this is nuts that women are going to leave all their homes and all their comforts and also the rules of that world. Like, how do they just walk out and go ask them? Like, it's just a wild thing for them to do. And the more I was trying to tell the story, the more I realized it's because of her. It had to be because of her, so I set up the story, if you read the book, that she's really their guardian. And as a queen, it limits how far people are willing to attack these women. You have a group of women walking through the forest. You don't have highways in those days, right? You don't have, so you have women walking through a path in the forest from one town to the next. They're totally vulnerable. Anything could, there were bandits and all kinds of people in the forest. Like, anything could have happened to these women. And yet they managed to go from Kapilavastu to Vesali without incident, that we are told. And so I imagined their safety must have depended on her, that she represents a kind of authority. She can take that authority. And I think that's something to think about. I can't prove this, but I do wonder about her authority and her position that would make bandits question whether they would do it, that would allow these women to feel safe enough to run away with her, I do think her status changes things. When we did the thing in Korea, for those of you who were there, when I did my session on the book in Korea, we did this panel, and the first part of the panel was 3 women from Bhutan who talked about their experience of getting ordination in Bhutan. And so so many of you might know that Himalayan traditions don't have full ordination, right? And so never have, like they just never brought it with them. So there's no full ordination. They don't even have to worry about the Garudamas. They don't have the full ordination, right? It just doesn't exist. And women have been asking the Dalai Lama, and Tenzin Palmo has been part of that. But people have been banging the door asking, please allow women to take full ordination. Then we can deal with the Garudama. We can't even get to that part. And the Dalai Lama has stalled. He's in a very delicate situation, but he's just never done it. And so there's been a frustration, and it's been decades of asking for this. And finally, the king of Bhutan said, we're doing this. And the head abbot of the lineage there said, we're doing it. And so the 2 men, the 2 power stakeholders, the 2 authority figures of Bhutan, they said yes. And the door opened, and the women who were banging at the gate were finally able to go through, and 153 women were ordained. Never before done in history. And it was very striking to me to hear them speak before I spoke. I thought, oh, you need the authority figures to open the gate. Like the women can keep pushing on the gate, but like there's a point at which either you break it down and you break the system, or you keep banging on the door until somebody opens it. And so the king of Bhutan opened the door, and I think Mahapajapati opened the door. I think, and the Buddha had to open it with her, but I think she was the one. You couldn't have asked Vimala to do it. She's like an impoverished prostitute. She has no power. She has no authority. She has no self-confidence. You can't ask her to take that risk. That's also not fair, is to ask the most impoverished to take the risk to challenge the system. You can't do that. And so it needs to be the queen. And I don't think I appreciated how important she was. Like she's the one because she's the one, but I came to realize, no, she's the one. She has to be the one. It's her. And why don't we have statues of her? Where is she? Like, I don't understand what we've done. We have like virtually no temples dedicated to Maya, the Buddha's mother. We have no temples dedicated to Yashoda. We have no temples dedicated to Mahapajapati. I don't understand. What is Buddhism doing? Like, let's wake up already. These women should have statues, and they should be, if we have such a prolific visual culture in Buddhism, which we do, and we have thousands of images in every temple, where are these women? We get like Geshe Tsogyal, and we get a couple of them, but they're always like half the size. And then we get like celestial imagined characters like Tara, and where's Mahapajapati? I want her to have a statue. I think she should be on a shrine. She pushed the door. We should know our ancestors.
Sonja, I think, isn't there a statue of Mahapajapati at Chenrezig?
It is. We do have we do. I shall send you a photo of it.
Could you please send her to me? I need to see her. Oh, you really?
It's beautiful. It's sitting outside the Gompa, but very close to the nuns' community. And yes, she is beautiful. And yes.
I just want to mention, Sonja, too. I'll mention that how that came about was Margot. So one of the lay women who is herself a force of nature. And she wanted to meet with the Geshe, and so she met with him, and she requested they have this statue. And he was surprised. He was stunned. And he said, okay, statue. Then you ordain. Well, that hasn't happened. But yes, so she herself, I mean, her story is quite remarkable in terms of during COVID, when we went into lockdown at Chenrezig Institute, and, we're all in lockdown. And she almost single-handedly set up the system for us to go online very early on. And she had so many challenges, and she's just been so persistent. Like, she just like single-minded and just like, we've got to do it like this. We've got to do it like this. And now she's left and there's a whole team there doing that as a result of her persistence, because she was knocked back a lot and she didn't let it stop her. So she was.
But how did she get this statue?
Well, a lot of statues were being ordered from Vietnam, which is where we're getting statues made. So I don't know. I can't remember if she raised funds for it or.
But did they have a tradition of making it, or did they make a new statue to make Mahapajapati?
They made a new statue.
So this doesn't exist anywhere.
That's right.
This is like, yeah.
We'll definitely send it to. We've got photos.
Yeah, I really need to see her. I think I'm trying to remember, but Venerable Dhammananda, I went to visit her in Thailand, and she's created all these statues all over her nunnery. She's the most senior ordained nun in Thailand. I think she might have created something, but I'm not, but it's only the women, it's not part of the tradition, right? Which is so women have to go and kind of artificially add this. But I guess that's what we have to do. But I think it's so bizarre that we don't have it. Huh?
It's definitely not part of the Tibetan tradition. And the fact that, and she was like, we have a nunnery here. It's nuns. Yeah. We don't even have the first nun here. She was, so that, and, people like, and it's very hard to research, actually. So even the depiction, we don't know 100%, but, it represents that for us. So, doing the best we can with that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you have her. That's very exciting.
Sonja, is there anything you'd like to add just about the story generally?
No, look, I've just enjoyed hearing the whole story, and yes, it's really beautiful. I mean, it really just tells the story of women through the ages, doesn't it? Yes, we can all relate to it in some way. So yes, I think it's wonderful. I'll have to read the book. And, if you could, Vanessa, if you could just put your email address in the chat, then I'll send the photo to you. And yes.
You actually have her email. You got it for me, so.
Okay, all right. No, that's fine. Oh, there you go. Thank you very much. I will. I'll send you the photo because I'll have to dig it out. And but she is beautiful. So.
Thanks, Sonja. We're running. We're over time actually. So, just anyone else who would like to say something before we close, let us know. I can see Roy's joined us. Roy's doing a PhD on Buddhist women. Would you like to say?
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to say something, Roy?
Hi, guys. Yeah. The project's going really well. We're in the final wrap up. We've got the chapter on ordination and monastic rules is just about finished. We're just about to start the chapter on feminism, and that's going to be an interesting write-up. And then the final chapter is on Buddhism in Australia. We've got 2 publications so far, and we've got a YouTube extract from the ASA conference is online as well. So it's going fantastically, thank you.
And your thoughts generally on the nuns community in Australia? What have you been finding out by talking to them all?
This has been fantastic. I get to ride around Australia on a motorbike talking to some of the most beautiful people in the world. This is great. Look, Australia's a great place for nuns. It is. Now, my project's very, very much focused on the Theravada nuns. I'd love to expand it to everyone, but it's just not doable in a 3-year PhD. Compared to a lot of the other countries, I mean, our nuns have got a foothold. They've been able to practice now since 2009, so they're actually building up the stage where they can start their own ordinations now. They've got they're building their reputation, their gravitas. They're expanding the community, and they've got the ability to do so here. I mean, they're still getting kicked in the teeth left, right, and center. That's undisputable. but at least they're not getting shoved into jail or anything like that. There's a big difference between the city nuns and the country nuns, but we found that the country nuns are quite sheltered by comparison. The city nuns are doing it really hard. They're in these small little viharas, and they're actually copying a lot of the crap from the more orthodox communities. We're seeing a lot of interdisciplinary mix that you don't see as much with a lot of the nuns, where there's a lot more support between the different nuns groups. We're seeing a lot of internet usage here in Australia, more than a lot of places, and even just a lot of the small viharas just to have the Avada. I mean, they have to go online and have like Zoom meetings just to have the Avada. Some really interesting stuff happening there. We've got 24 interviews have been completed. That's 12 nuns, 8 monks, and 4 lay people. And yeah, the 2 articles in the YouTube video are publicly available now, which is fantastic.
Thanks, Roy, and it's terrific work.
Can we put links to that on our Sakyadhita?
Yeah.
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah.
I can send them all through to you.
Yeah, if you could send them to me again, Roy, I'll put them up.
Onto it right now.
That would be great. Okay, if there's no other comments, Richard, do you want to say something? Yasmin? Oh. Okay, Richard, you'll have to unmute, darling.
Hi, and really sorry for getting the time wrong. My computer said it was 9 o'clock my time, but there's a difference.
It's
a different time zone thing.
We're explaining that to Vanessa. But
very sorry. But hello, Vanessa.
Hi, nice to see you again. Yeah.
Just it'd be lovely if on the site we could all see that photo. I would love to see the photo if it went onto the Sakyadhita site. The one of the one that Sonja was talking about. I would love to see that photo.
I'll see if I can find it. Keep talking.
At some stage. Yeah, that would be gorgeous.
Yeah.
And just while I've got you there, Captive, when will this talk, which I missed, be up and running? Like in a few weeks or in a few days, or?
It usually takes about 4 or 5 days to get it posted.
But Thank you so much. Beautiful.
But we'll get it up as quickly as possible.
Fantastic. Happy Christmas to everyone.
Yeah, look, I'm sorry, I just can't find the photo. But I will send it. I will send it to as many of you as I've got your emails. So if you want me to be included, put your email up on the chat room now, and I'll send it to you. And Sonja probably has some other photos. Do you, Sonja?
Well, I certainly have a photo of Mahajapati, but yeah, I'm not sure how many. There'll be some on the Chenrezig Institute Facebook page. So, but I'll have to go looking for it.
Yeah.
So, but yes, when I find it, I can send it to you, Helen, and it can go on the Sakyadhita page.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
It might be also nice to hear Margot tell, her motivation and research into that too.
Yeah, if someone could talk to her, that would be great.
Yeah, so Margot, we know Margot, Margozata Dorosky. She did that Bikuni film in Sri Lanka.
Oh, that's Margot.
That's Margot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So she's very comfortable in this space of challenging, forward the women's view. Yeah.
Well, I'll see if she'll write something, or I'll talk to her and put it in our newsletter and make sure Vanessa gets it. But we'll send the photo before that. Okay, everyone, the day's rolling on, so I think we'll wrap up there. And thank you so much, Vanessa.
Thank you.
We've really enjoyed.
Thank you very much.
Hearing the story.
Thank you.
And I can really recommend. It's very easy to read your book. It just flows on from chapter to chapter, and you're learning a lot about the women of the time. So thank you very much. The book is called The Gathering, and I read it digitally, but I'm not sure. It should be in our bookshops fairly soon, but it's definitely available digitally. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Choki, do you want to sign us off?
Okay, so we're just gathering together all our positive energy that we've generated here, and particularly our mission to put to the forefront the stories of women in Buddhism, that they may resonate throughout the lands and redress any confusion in people's minds, and that we may continue to flourish and grow and spread and elevate the position of women in Buddhism. That's our mission. Gewadi Nududa Lama Sangye Gubune Drowa Chika Malupa De Salago Pasho Janchu Sencho Grimposhe Makye Panam Ge Kuchi Ge Panyam Pame Payang Gumni Gondu Pelwashu. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for having
Vanessa.
me.
Thank
Thanks very
you.
much.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you.
Enjoy the
Bye.
rest of your day. Bye.
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 Thanks, Vanessa.
It was my pleasure. You guys are wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.